Hi, I'm Becky O'Connor and I'm hosting today's webcast. It's on the theme of what are the most profitable trends in sustainable investing, and I'm joined today by Amanda Young, who is Head of Global ESG at Aberdeen Standard, Mike Appleby, who's Investment Manager for Liontrust Sustainable Futures, and Damien Lardoux, who is a Portfolio Manager for EQ Investors. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
People are really interested in sustainable investing, which is great. And obviously they would like to make some money from investing sustainably too. Amanda, I wonder if you would start us off with a question that's come up a bit recently, which is, aren't sustainability and profitability objectives fundamentally at odds? Can you really do both?
There are people out there who believe that you can't be sustainable and make a profit. Which I fundamentally disagree with. If companies are being innovative and creating products that ultimately contribute towards a sustainable society, be it a green sustainable society or offering people access to education and resources, then ultimately that's a good thing. And if you can invest in those companies for a return, you are financing that. And so for me, you can see it going hand in hand. However, corporates have a very bad reputation. So I have some sympathy with the argument that companies and profits, that companies and sustainability shouldn't be seen together.
Okay. And Mike, would you tend to agree that you can, well, hopefully you would agree that you can make a profit from sustainable investing?
Absolutely. I think if you look at our economy and you see the big structural changes that are going on that need to happen that are positive, that can be a source of information that can help you find companies that are going to perform really well as a result of the product or service that they provide being in demand. And there are lots of examples of that. So I think that I would turn it around the other way and say, if you don't understand the big structural trends that are going on in any industry before allocating capital into it, then you're much more likely to come unstuck than if you've taken the time to try and understand what's going on.
Okay. Damien, presumably you're seeing more investors wanting to make a profit from sustainability. Do you agree that the two can go hand in hand in your experience from managing the portfolio?
Sure. I mean, I fully agree with what has been said, is that the companies which tend to be innovative, which are helping to tackle all the issues we are aware of, tend to do a lot better. Because there's, unfortunately, there's a growing need for solutions for all those issues, and those companies are involved in providing solutions, are doing really well. But I think not only in what we've seen, but actually the academic research has shown that actually if you take into account, and this is probably more broadly, environmental and socially and sort of governance type of criteria into your investment process, you can significantly reduce the risk you have within your portfolio. So that's sort of in terms of, if you think about your return, you have to think about the journey as well to get there. So that's quite interesting. But also there are more and more studies showing that you can outperform. And that's, I think, what's quite reassuring, is that we're telling you that, but actually the academic research is backing it.
Yeah, okay. I mean, sustainability is quite a broad theme. If we were to break it down into trends and look at profitability within certain trends, what trends could we pick out, Mike?
Well, something that's happening really interesting from an investment perspective at the moment is what's happening in transport and in cars. And if you look at cars, there are two really big trends that are going on. These are happening, over the next decade plus. So these are structural trends. The first one is reducing emissions from the tailpipe. And that is really because people live in urban environments and the urban air quality is, just not good enough. And that sees bits of electronics on in an internal combustion engine to reduce the amount of emissions. It sees hybrids and eventually electric vehicles. So that's a big trend that's going on. Another one that's going on is to do with improving safety in cars. So no one really wants to buy the least safe car in its class. And these car manufacturers are competing with one another as to how safe their car is. And we've seen a huge emergence of active safety technology. So things like active emergency braking, which when something comes in front of your car, the car automatically slows down, brings itself to a halt. It can understand if something's coming across, and there are sensors around the car. And those are two huge trends that are going on. And if you apply that to companies that you can invest in, there are companies that make amazing headlights called Hella, and these headlights are reducing, improving visibility on people, obstacles on or around the road, and improving safety. And also you have the sensors that are on the car so that it can work out what's going on around it. There's a company called Valeo, which is a French company that's very active in that. And then all of these bits require digital, the ability to actually analyze this data very quickly in the car. And those require these semiconductor chips. And there's a company called Infineon, which is a German company, which makes these. So those are big trends going on. And the remarkable bit about it is that if you look at what the market thinks these companies are going to grow at, it thinks that the immense profitable growth that they're experiencing now will tail away very quickly in 1 or 2 years' time. But actually our view from this research shows that we think that these trends aren't going away and that these companies are all fundamentally undervalued at the moment. Okay. So that's one example.
Okay. And Amanda, are there any other trends that Mike hasn't touched on there that you would like to single out for comment?
I think what he said is very interesting, but it's looking very much at the micro. So perhaps I could take a step back and look at the macro. And rather than looking at trends, looking at problems. Because if you can assess what the problems are, then it's easier to identify the solutions. So for me, there are three key areas that I think are big, hot topics, if you like. The first is the very obvious one of climate change, but obviously that infiltrates so much of what we do, particularly in relation to energy efficiency, reducing emissions, and the sort of whole global climate change issue. The second is the fact that we as consumers are consuming far faster than the world is able to cope with, so that unsustainable production and consumption. And that feeds into your first point, which is, can you keep producing and really be sustainable? So looking for companies that have circular economy business models, that are not using raw materials, that are recycling things. These are trends that I think are going to grow as we demand, as consumers demand more products that aren't placing a strain on the world's resources. And the third thing is the rising inequalities. You only have to look around the world. You see the poverty that people are experiencing, you see the lack of education that people have, and rising inequalities is not a developed emerging market issue. It's very much a global issue, and you're seeing that across the world. And you have lots of debates around remuneration and how people are paid, their working conditions and how they're treated. And so if you can be finding solutions to the inequality piece, I think that's another area. So the climate change, unsustainable production and consumption, and the rising inequalities piece.
Okay. I'm interested in whether some of these problems, as you've laid out, are more profitable to solve than others, which is, is that to do with the rate of change in each of those areas? For example, is solving climate change more profitable because there's a lot happening on emissions with electric vehicles, or is social investing and helping to alleviate poverty less profitable because we're a bit further behind in that? Damien, perhaps you could offer a view on.
I think it's a very good question in the sense that there are some need, and if we think about the goals, the most pressing to be tackled, for example, no hunger is a big one. But actually, having companies which are really trying to tackle it, you will really struggle to find many of them. But there are some trends, like aging population, and obesity. So everything which is having an impact on our health, and we know that our health is deteriorating. So but we have in the developed world, and even developing world, sort of a huge purchasing power, and we can and we want to, live longer and live sort of healthier and so on. So we've got a lot of money to spend. So as a result, the companies which are, bringing new drugs, for example, or developing new technologies which are going to help, solve or sort of and cure disease, are doing really, really well. So they will see their earnings, growing very quickly, and as they are developing platforms of new drugs and new technologies, they can, sort of, if you want to develop even more and tackle more, a bigger part of the problem. So you're absolutely right. So so that's what we say to our clients, is that you're absolutely right. If you really care about, let's say, for example, education or no hunger, we can help you and find companies and fund managers who can tackle that problem. But you have to realize and accept that actually it will be a relatively small portion of your investments.
Okay, and is that reflected in the funds themselves? Are you weighted towards climate change solutions rather than some of the others, or are you trying to find a balance?
Well, there are lots of different ways to do it, and we have 22 different investment themes that go right across. And I suppose when you think about profitability, it's like anything else. Does that company have something that's hard to replicate? So if we think about climate change for a moment, we think that the energy efficiency piece, and maybe some of the wind turbine manufacturers, they do genuinely have a much higher barrier to entry. It's much harder for people to copy what they're doing. But weirdly, if you look at solar, it appears it's not been profitable at all, although it's an incredibly successful way of generating clean energy. As an investment, as a result of huge amounts of competition coming in from Asia and them competing on price, it's actually been very difficult to make any money out of solar, although it's the cheapest form of energy you can install in places like the Middle East at the moment. So I think what this brings together is that you need to understand the trend, but you need to go a little bit beyond just hoping that the good guys are going to win, and you need to do some normal analysis to work out whether the companies you're investing in have genuinely got a competitive advantage and you think they're going to be worth more in the future. So we see more in energy efficiency than in renewables there, as an example. Okay. And also on healthcare, there's a huge revolution going on around the ability for people to understand how genetics work better, and the idea that we might be able to awaken people's own immune system to better fight and defeat some of the things that we're having to resort to using chemistry, basically. And there are some really interesting opportunities there. The companies that are making the picks and shovels, if you like, the analogy with the mining industry, it's not a great analogy, but in this sense, all of this research and development involves antibodies, it involves wonderful bits of very complex equipment that you need to be able to do DNA sequencing. And that's an area that we do have exposure to, and they are very high barriers to entry. It's very difficult to copy those. So.
Okay. Amanda, I wonder if there are some areas that are quite profitable because they compromise somewhere else, and you look at environmental, social and governance factors, so you can see, if you have one company that is developing a solution on the environment, is there some compromise somewhere else down the line that kind of challenges that investment?
I absolutely agree that you have to look at companies holistic, and you've already talked about the fact that you need to look at everything when you're investing in a company, through balance sheet through to what they're going to do. Let's take Tesla as an example. Everybody knows Tesla. It's a very well-known brand. Their cars are amazing. They are revolutionising the autos industry. Yet there have been a lot of questions over the governance at Tesla, over the board structure, over the potential remuneration of its CEO, who is, yes, a very innovative man, but is it right that you have uncapped pay for somebody when the rest of the world is suffering? And that potential payout could be huge. And we've seen that with Persimmon, for instance, the unintended consequences that companies end up in a situation that they hadn't initially intended to be in, i.e. paying huge amounts of money to chief executives. The other thing at Tesla is there have been some questions over their working practices within the Tesla manufacturing suites. And so you do need to look holistically. You look at a high level, this is a fantastic piece of equipment. It's going to appeal to a certain marketplace. It's really revolutionizing what the auto industry is already doing. But you have to think about the company as a whole, and you have to think about their governance structures and their whole ethos about how they behave. And so sometimes it's quite difficult for us in the sustainable investment industry when you see something so innovative and you get really excited, and yet your industry to some extent can potentially be tarnished by poor corporate behavior or unintended consequences of decision making within companies. So it's something that we as investors need to be cognizant of and make sure that we understand all the different aspects of the company, not just the products and services that they're manufacturing.
Okay. Is it possible to have a perfect company, do you think, that scores well on all the factors, or is that impossible?
No, it is not. I mean, for example, at EQ we focus a lot on the concept of impact investing, which is investing on companies which are making a strong positive impact on the society or the environment through their product and services. But what we always say to clients is that there isn't a perfect company. Companies are on a journey. They may have a fantastic product, but if for example, they might not score well in terms of gender diversity, for example, or in terms of how they're treating with their workforce, or all their sort of their stakeholders. So we have to accept that there isn't any perfect companies, but what we want from the companies, and I'm sure that's what you guys do on a daily basis, to engage with them and to see them being receptive to critiques and get them on a journey to improve their practices. And also because I think for all the things it takes time, the world is changing as well, so what mattered like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, probably is not as important now. Maybe the problem has been fixed. So we want these companies to also accept that they're on a journey.
Okay. Mike, have you come across any near perfect, maybe not totally perfect?
I think if you give anyone a search engine and they use that company name and controversies, you'll always find something. But I think that what isn't appreciated is that if you look at companies, say they're all in the same industry, all telcos or banks or whatever, everyone assumes that they're all very, very similar. But in fact, there are huge differences in their strategies. For example, in banks, the incentives that sales forces have to sell the products. You can have banks where it's all about the client outcomes and feedback about it, and you have other banks where it's just about volume of sales. And it's no surprise that the banks that are thinking and are remunerated, their sales force are remunerated on how well that product suits the client, will do better when we have corrections going on. So I think it is a really useful way, by looking at these sort of environmental, social and governance aspects of the company's operations. It's really a type of proxy for the quality of management. If a company is really on top of lots of things, it's a really well managed company, they will be able to articulate very well about what their big issues are and how they're doing and how they're measuring against stretching targets. But other companies that are perhaps more reactively managed will show up in that kind of analysis. So although there's a lot going on, but it is worth diving in there and trying to find out these differences, because it can lead you to make better investment decisions.
There's been quite a lot of talk of greenwash now, because sustainability is such a key marketing thing as well.
Absolutely.
So does that make it harder for you, or does it make it easier in a way to kind of go in and unpack the genuine efforts and the show, if you like, and how do you do that?
I think it's a hard job, and I think it is harder, and the reason I think it's harder is because there's more information, and there is that element of greenwashing. So 20 years ago, I sit in front of a chief executive of a mining company and asked them if they had an environmental report, and they would go, "Why do I need one of those?" Well, we've moved on a long way from there. And now there is an element of being sometimes overburdened with the amount of information that's thrown at us. But your point about greenwashing is a valid one, and I think green bonds is a really excellent example of that. The concept of a green bond, i.e. raising money that you can finance green projects with, is a really, really exciting one. These are things that can ultimately make a physical difference to the world, because it's about investing in infrastructure and projects. However, because there's been such a growth in the marketplace, we as investors have to be very cognizant of what that green bond is actually ultimately setting out to do. Who's issuing the green bond? Do they have the same principles as the underlying investment opportunity? And not just that, then how do you monitor that the money has been deployed properly to those projects, that the outcomes of those projects have been reported? So as an example, hydro dam. Sounds like a great idea, a fantastic concept. So you go off and then you find that in order to build the hydro dam, you have displaced 6,000 people. So the hydro, yes, is a positive, but the corporate behaviour is a negative. So yes, there is greenwashing. People have seen this as a way to make money, and we as investors have to be harder nosed than ever before to really try and get under the bonnet of what companies are trying to sell, and make sure that we are holding executives to account, that we have proper research and analysis, that we work together on occasions to make sure that we have a voice that is actually driving the industry in the way that we want it to. So yes, greenwashing is a problem, and SDG washing is the next thing, Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
Lots of companies saying, oh, we want to report about how we are contributing to the SDGs, but is that just washing and making their corporate behaviour looking right, or are they actually able to provide proper measurement and proper outcomes of their corporate behaviour and their activities that gives us assurance as investors that they're doing the right thing?
And so company engagement is a really, really big part of that.
Very important.
And is there any evidence that company engagement, over whatever term it might be, improves profitability? Or are we still too early on in that journey?
Have you seen any in the research? I think there's certainly anecdotally it feels like improving the management score on ESG does ultimately mean that company is rated more highly, and therefore its shares are worth more. But I don't have any stats to hand.
I mean, for us, it's so we work with fund managers, and for us, it's a must-have that fund managers engage with the companies. But it's a very good point that whether or not this is going to add value to the companies over the long term, probably, because they will if it's around issues with the workforce, maybe employees will feel better working for that company, and then that should benefit the company in the long run. But I think the fruits that you get from the engagement work, you will see it over a number of years, potentially decades. So I think measuring it is quite hard, but I think not doing it for us is a big red flag.
Okay. So for me, there's two elements of engagement as a fund manager. You engage with a company because you don't have the information available to you to make the proper decisions, or the information that you have, you just really don't understand. So you need to sit down and look people in the eyes to actually get a sense of what is it you're telling me, and is it something I believe, or we need more information on these particular issues of your business. So there's that fact-finding analysis piece of engagement. And then there's that being good stewards of our clients' money and driving change, that agents of change piece. And if you have 10% of a company, you have a massive voice at that table, and you have the ability to drive change. And we certainly have seen over the decades, engaging with companies, improvements in corporate behaviour, and it comes back to the point of this being a proxy for the quality of the company and the management of the company. I've always argued it is very difficult to isolate environmental, social, governance issues and our performance and put those together, because it needs to be part of an investment process, not done in isolation to your investment process. So you need to be able to judge everything as a whole. But for me, you need that fact-finding piece. Reports can only tell you one, certain amount, and then you need that ability to drive change within companies.
Before we have a look at some of the questions that have come in on Twitter and on the live feed, I just wanted to ask one more question from me, which is, are there any countries which are really leading the way on certain issues? For example, sustainability in China, is that, could you single out any particular geographic region that's really, going for gold on one issue?
I might give you an example, if I may, but clearly to me that would be the Nordics. The Nordic region. There was a good example of ExxonMobil. There was a resolution put forward by the Church of England, a number of Nordic investors, asking ExxonMobil to disclose what would be the impact of the 2-degree scenario on their business model, and then the management asked shareholders to vote against, and Vanguard, BlackRock, the big sort of passive asset managers decided to follow what the management was asking for. And then we found that very poor, and many investors found that very sort of poor practice. So we engaged with Vanguard, for example, and we met with their global head of corporate governance, and the feedback was that actually most feedback they had and most sort of anger they had was coming from the Nordic region. So clearly showing that they really care about those issues. But I don't know if that's something you also sort of come across.
Yeah, I think in terms of the investment style and approach, Europe seems to be much more proactive. But there are different things going on in different places. So in terms of environmental regulations, there's some emerging markets that have incredibly stringent environmental regulations. So like Brazil has extraordinary, all the companies in Brazil, broadly speaking, are really ahead of the game. And the reason is that they need to do that to be able to sell their goods into the US, because there's kind of a sort of mini barrier there. And again, China, in terms of renewable energy, is extraordinary. How much of renewable energy is getting installed, and how much of the renewable energy capital equipment that we use is actually made in China is extraordinary. And yet there are still, certain issues, working condition issues, corporate governance issues, which is why it's important to think of these things, that they are interlinked, and to stand back, because we get these really perverse outcomes. Everyone was obsessed with just climate change and diesel, and ignored the nitrous oxide and sulfur oxide and particulate matter that came out of diesels, because they sort of had climate change goggles on, and that was how they wanted to view the world. And it's turned out that actually is really bad for local air quality, and we've seen diesel car sales in Europe collapse as a result. So I think it's important for people to try not to just look at the world as one issue, like plastics or equality, or I think it's great if people want to champion single things, but it's good to try and be aware that there are lots of things that you need to take into consideration to try and make sure that you've got a good set of businesses that you're backing, and that hopefully will be worth more in the future through positive things that they're doing. And I think the greenwash thing, just coming back really quickly, I would really like to see, when people are reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals, that they report on the ones that they're detracting from as well. I think that would be great, because it's all very well only talking about the good things, but you want to talk about the things that you need to get better too.
Yeah, good idea. So we have had some questions which I'll touch on quickly, because we've only got 1 minute left. So this is from Rachel on Twitter. What will it take for all investments to be sustainable? And do you see a timescale for this? If you wouldn't mind just giving a fairly quick view each on that. Is it going to happen?
The world is full of greed, unfortunately. I just think, as much as I would love to see the face of capitalism changing, it's never going to be 100% all okay, unfortunately. However, the trends are big enough to make a substantial change. And I would just encourage everybody to think about where their money goes.
Great. Mike?
Yes, I think that there's incredible momentum moving with this, but I do think that to try and stay positive, because there was a time 10 years ago, if you thought that people would really have the whole climate risk thing together and people divesting from it with huge pension funds, it would be very hard to believe that. So what tends to happen with these things, they move in big shifts, and I think it's all moving in the right direction, although I'd love to see it happen 20 times faster, but let's stay positive.
Yeah. 100% sustainable, Damien? Will we live to see the day?
I'm very optimistic in nature, so I think that's possible. But I think what we need to see happening a lot more is actually the end investor. Each one of us actually talking to our advisors or talking to our friends or talking to, and then asking more questions about what we really invest in. I think that's what really missing is that most people actually don't really know what they're doing, and actually they don't really know that with their investments they probably are quite harmful, investing in quite harmful companies, whereas actually in their life actually they're probably trying to work with charities or doing a lot of good. So I think when all these investors will wake up and and ask the right questions to the advisors, then I think we'll see a huge spike in demand for sustainable investing.
Okay, well let's hope so. It's a good goal to have in mind anyway, but it's up to us. And these guys are the experts who are going to help us with our investments. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining in. It's gone really quickly. I didn't actually go through all the questions on Twitter, but I think we covered most of them, so that's good. Very inspiring. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for watching.